if there's one thing, so last year I worked all across Europe, all across Asia, and one thing that I kept hearing on and on is that the pace of change was accelerating to the point where it was becoming difficult for people to manage that change, to really understand what they should be doing, because it wasn't just the pace of change in consumer behavior, but as Nola referred to, we're sort of getting whipsawed, if I can use an Americanism, by rapid changes in things that are outside of our control. So let me let me transport you to the mythical land of Zucklandia. Any similarity to Westeros in the Game of Thrones is purely coincidental or down to the lack of a creative budget for my small business. So we've got ZBS, the Zucklandia Broadcasting System. And a couple of years ago, their director general got very, very excited because there was Facebook Live, and he's like, it's just like TV, but with emojis. How exciting is that? All we need to do is put our live feed into Facebook, and it's going to be great. And more than that, Facebook's, hey, they're splashing out $50 million on this. We're going to make money on this, you know? I mean, I want to be BuzzFeed. I can get $3 million. Or look, they even pay some public broadcasters. NPR is on that league table. And so we all rush to Facebook Live because we are told, and I was there too, we all said, hey, if we do Facebook Live, if we do video on Facebook, they're gonna push our stuff into the newsfeed more. We'll get more viewers on that. And that was really great for about 8 months. And then Facebook stopped paying. And there were even articles about how there were French publishers who'd become almost addicted to Facebook's payments for Facebook Live. So suddenly all that investment, all of those workflow changes that you might have made to feed the beast that was Facebook went away. So, okay, well, now it's watch. And so live becomes watch. And maybe if you've got some scripted programs, Facebook is gonna pay you. But we'll have to see, because the big reason why Facebook is doing this is that it wants a piece of YouTube's $9.8 billion advertising pie, right? So that's Facebook's video strategy this month. So going back to our mythical land of Zucklandia, and the DG, after Facebook Live, he said, okay, I was having dinner with my niece, and she showed me Snapchat, and it was so exciting. And I didn't really understand it, but then I saw Snapchat Discover, and it's just like TV. And she showed me Vogue, and they had so many followers and so many viewers. And so you change your workflow again, and you even hire a couple of millennial producers and presenters to do it, and you think, hey, this is going to be great. And everything's swimming along, and you launch in October 2016, and then Instagram rolls out stories. And in 2 months, Snapchat's growth outside of the US goes to, wait for it, 0. And it's recovered a little bit in 2017, but not much. And there was even some very, very colorful language being used about Snapchat at the end of the year, saying how screwed is Snapchat. And they said, well, almost not as screwed as Twitter. So that's Snapchat. So the DG, was a little bit upset about that. But, he says, oh, Facebook's still sending us a lot of traffic. Then, unfortunately, Zucklandia was one of the countries where they rolled out the Explore tab. And suddenly, organic reach falls off a cliff. And I have a client who I was just working with in the UK, and they referred to midsummer last year, even though they didn't have Explore in the UK, as the June Doom. Because basically their reach went like this. And what some of my clients have seen is that a change in the Facebook algorithm cut their, not just organic reach, but in some instances, their paid views by 1/3 overnight. So this is the part of the background that we're seeing, is that there are new gatekeepers between us and our audiences when it comes to digital. But, we're public service media. And we have to focus on the public. So some of that is we have to engage with social media. Now, it's really easy to see headlines like this and say, broadcast TV still tops digital video. And that's true. Broadcast linear TV is still strong. And if you look at it, watching broadcast TV, 53 to 97, it's up around, it's 87%, and it's still 76% from 18 to 36-year-olds. So there's millennials and Gen Zs that we want to reach. But what's really interesting is if you ask, do you watch linear TV at the time that it's broadcast, things start to change. So 42% of 18 to 36-year-olds watch linear TV at the time of broadcast. So we know that. There's lots of catch-up TV going on. And 72% of the 53 to 97%-year-olds. But once we start getting to some of the other things, now this really surprised me. If you asked about listening to radio, more 18 to 36-year-olds actually listen to radio than 53 to 97-year-olds. But when we get into the digital activities, things start to change a lot. So do you stream video, TV, or movies digitally? 86% of 18 to 36-year-olds, almost a mirror of that 53 to 97-year-old percentage that we saw with broadcast TV. It's even more stark when you look at streaming music. So you've got 70% of millennials and Gen Z, and then only 22% amongst the 53 to 97-year-olds. And then when you ask them about listening to podcasts, still a minority sport, but 39% of millennials and Gen Z are actually listening to podcasts now. It's really expanded. Now, these are global figures. They're not just US figures, so they capture a lot of different activities, and there's probably a fair amount of variation. But these are the questions. How does public media respond to the shifts in digital audience behavior? Because it is happening. And of course, it's especially happening across the generations. So we want to make sure that we are as relevant to our future audiences as we are to our strongest audiences in older age groups. How does public media respond to these rapid shifts from major digital platforms? That's been the real disruptive change in our industry the last 2 years. And again, how do we deal with these differences in audience behaviors across age groups? Now, I look at the New York Times, and they released, I think it was their 4th innovation report in 4 or 5 years last year, Journalism That Stands Apart. And they looked at everything that they were doing, and they made some really bold self-assessments and strong statements about what they were doing and what they needed to do. And they said, while the past 2 years have been a time of significant innovation, the pace must accelerate. And I'm sure you're hearing that a lot in your organizations. People saying, we must change faster. We must have a culture of innovation. Now, I like this next statement. Too often, digital progress has been accomplished through workarounds. And I think that for production people, you can feel that. A lot of this feels like it's a temporary solution, that it's not very robust, that really we did this workaround for a while, but it's not something we can do on an ongoing basis. And after a while, those small little fixes just make what we do a little bit less robust. But the New York Times says to get past those workarounds, they wanted to tear apart the barriers. And I think this was an important statement. We must differentiate between mission and tradition. What we do because it's essential to our values, and what we do because we've always done it that way. And I think that's really clear. Often when I'm a journalist, just like Noel, I often say I'm a recovering journalist. And I say I am a very traditional journalist when it comes to my standards and my ethics, but I always use cutting-edge tools. I use the latest things I can use to reach the audience and engage them in new ways. So that's some philosophical ideas. Last year I did some research for the Reuters Institute at Oxford called Beyond the Article. And what we were trying to do is look at how news organizations in particular were creating cutting-edge storytelling formats. So things that did not look like a standard traditional text article. Because a lot of times, whether we're broadcasters or print media, we think in text when we're online, because that's the most natural way to do it, with some videos peppered around, or maybe a catch-up service. So some of the strategies that the organizations were looking at to accelerate innovation, first of all, they all had some type of audience-focused product management framework to help them set priorities. So they were really looking at what their audience maybe not just wanted, but how they were getting their information. And that helped set the priorities. Because I can say priority setting has been one of the biggest challenges for news organizations. And as the pace of change has accelerated and the disruption has gotten greater in certain parts of the media industry, priority setting has become an even more acute challenge. They have flexible development strategies. And so sometimes they would have in-house, especially if they were, we talked to some folks who were just digital startups, and they had a very traditional, almost tech startup function where you had a chief technical officer and some development staff. But we also saw external development groups. And what that allowed them to do was experiment more at a lower cost and deliver more quickly. And they also had product management staff that helped make sure the resources are available for projects and that resources were used most efficiently. And I think this is an innovation in some organizations, but it's probably pretty common standard practice in a lot of other organizations. And what I found, having worked both in print and in broadcast, is broadcasters tend to were more familiar with project managers than those folks who worked in sort of legacy print operations. So one of the big trends that we've seen is, again, all of the stuff that Facebook is doing is one thing. But when you look at consumers, a lot of consumers are switching from these open social platforms to closed social networks, to messaging platforms. Now, they're different in different countries. So you've got WhatsApp, which is very popular in Asia, but also Latin America, in certain parts of Latin America. You've got Facebook Messenger, which again looks very popular in certain parts of Europe. Line in Asia, Keiko Talk in South Korea. WeChat, which dominates in Chinese-speaking areas. I mean, you don't have the China figures in there, but WeChat's hugely dominant. And then Viber still remains quite popular in some countries too. So from a practical standpoint, we looked at the publisher in Finland, Helsingin Sanomat, the largest newspaper there. And they have a youth-focused page called Nyt. Apologies to all the Finns in the room, but to Nyt. And Nyt is a typical youth section for a newspaper. It tries to get young people into the habit of reading newspaper. And they, up until 2013, so relatively recently, they just basically took the stuff that was in the paper and shoveled it online. There wasn't really a digital strategy. And then in 2013, they launch a digital website and they have a digital focus. And for a very brief period of time, a year, Facebook is driving lots of traffic for them and everything is great. But within 1 year, the growth plateaus. And Jussi Pullinen says, if you want to reach young masses, Facebook is increasingly not the way, especially if we're talking about teens. So suddenly, their audience, their target audience behavior changed dramatically. So they knew from market research that 80% of young Finns use WhatsApp. So they said, okay, we're going to try a WhatsApp experiment, which I think is a good thing. Sometimes you have to experiment, and there are opportunities for public broadcasters to experiment that might not be available to commercial publishers, where the monetization is a little bit more of an issue. And it went really well. They just published the number. There was no marketing around it whatsoever. And they thought, oh, we'll get a few people because we're not pushing this really hard. In a week, they had 3,000 people. In 3 weeks, they had 5,000 people. And they had to say, okay, thank you very much, but we can't manage this very well. And it was very interactive. So they capped the experiment at 5,000, and they did some really great social media reporting, asked questions. But like I said, 5,000 was difficult, and they were having to manually manage 20 different broadcast lists on WhatsApp. So you can only have about 250 people per broadcast list. So Jussi says quite bluntly, it quickly became a manual labor hell. Now, the good thing is that there are some organizations that would say, we were a victim of our own success, we'll never do that again. And they said, no, actually, this was popular with our audience. How do we do this in a different way that is something we can manage? And so they reached out to an external development firm. So again, that kind of agile process. with a development firm, and they created their own messaging app that mimicked a lot of the activity that was on WhatsApp. And they were able to work with this external firm to launch it in 3 months. So it wasn't something that they thought, okay, it's great, we can't manage the WhatsApp, so in 6 months to 2 years, we'll have this WhatsApp killer. In 3 months, boom, they were able to develop it. And they've got some native advertising. But the key thing I want to focus on is they contracted with an outside development firm. They used an agile development process where they broke the project down into tasks and developed their mobile app in short sprints, usually 2 weeks. And again, they delivered it in 3 months. And that was one way that they were able to do that. Interestingly enough, so they had to cap the WhatsApp experiment at 5,000. They've got about 20,000 users on their WhatsApp-like app. Say that quickly in the morning. So it's just to show you you can be nimble. Another organization that I looked at was El País. And I will say, from an audience standpoint, they launched a VR product not because their audience was clamoring for it, but because it was their 40th birthday and they wanted to make a splash. So there wasn't any sort of really intense market need. As a matter of fact, as somebody who's used VR things, I say it's really high friction. And the number of times I actually sit down and put on the Google Cardboard is pretty low. But they launched it, it was great. And what I want to focus on is their innovation management approach. And I think this is a really good model. So they actually have long-standing relationships with digital agencies that they work with. And so if they want to try something, and VR is a perfect example, they didn't build up a huge team internally and radically rework their workflow. They worked with an external provider, tried this out. It allowed them to see not only build some capacity and understand what it took to do this, but it also allowed them to do this without hiring staff and kind of building up a big commitment so that it increased the cost. And in some ways, if it didn't work out, then sometimes if you bought in a bunch of staff, you've made that commitment. It's difficult. So this is a model that they've done for the last 10 years. And they've built up, as I say, some really good relationships with these external agencies. Now, if it is successful, then they bring it in-house. So they're not simply outsourcing for cost issues. They're outsourcing in a lot of ways to increase the pace of experimentation. When I was the digital research editor at The Guardian, I said, I'm going to bring the cost of experimentation as close to zero as possible so we can run as many experiments as possible, and then the ones that work will scale and think about how we monetize those. These days, I always think about monetization first with my commercial partners because we have to. They also have a production team, which, it was really a project management team. It just makes sure that of all the projects they've got, whether it's VR or a chat bot, that they've got the resources to do that at any given time. And I think that's really important, that you have people that take that project management load off of the editors and other staff, and they interact with all of the different parts. So whether it's production or creative, they've got those people working across the organization, which I think is important. So I'm going to kind of bring this to a close and hopefully take some of your questions, because I've been doing things with the EBU now for more than a decade. And when I started coming here, I was still working with the BBC. And there are two conversations I always have: rights and culture. So everybody's like, this would be really great if we could do, but the rights just won't let us do it. And then the other one is, it'd be really great to do this, but our culture just won't let us do this. It's the old Peter Drucker comment that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's a cliche these days, right? So it doesn't matter how cutting edge your strategy is. It doesn't matter how nimble and agile you think your organization is. If the culture's not right, it doesn't happen. Now, when I was at the BBC, I remember a good friend of mine, and this is back in 2005, 2006. I left in 2006. He said to me, Kevin, the BBC, sometimes it's not about achieving the change, it's who owns the change. And if someone doesn't own it, they'll kill it. And since then, I've spent a lot of time as a consultant, and I can say we shouldn't pick on the BBC. This is an issue that is a lot of that a lot of organizations struggle with, and I think on that one, I think of I'm paraphrasing Ulrich Hagerup here, who used to be the executive director of Danish radio, but I years ago heard him before he joined DR, and he said, it's really important that we remember that the competition is outside the building, not across the room or down the hall. And so in some ways, I think this is a really important shift. A lot of times we get so focused on our own internal barriers, our resource issues, that we become internally competitive. At the BBC, it was part of actually a strategy to create an internal competition model. And I'll give you this one little anecdote. I remember when I worked at the BBC, there was a great story about the Today program offering its guests to Sky just to shaft Newsnight. So it may be apocryphal, but it was circulated widely in the BBC at the time. So that's a philosophical provocation, but I want to A, talk a little bit about what I'm going to do in the tutorial, and B, finish this off with an innovation management structure that I really think is important. So this is, who's ever heard of or read The Innovator's Dilemma? Yeah? So you'll know Clay Christensen really well. And so Clay worked with a digital journalism, digital news executive called David Skock, and another colleague at the Harvard Business Review a few years back to create this thing called Be the Disruptor, which looked at innovation management in news organizations. And one of the key things that I took away from this is that we often focus on the culture, and therefore we never change the process or the task. And he says, don't focus on the process or culture first. There are three things that determine what your organization can do: resources, process, and priorities. Now, often we know that there are issues about, we think about those resources in terms of people, equipment, technologies, budgets, relationships with partners. But that doesn't, as Clay says, and Clay and David say, that doesn't come close to talking about the entire story of what an organization can do. Process. We build process so that we can do what we do day in, day out. And it's really focused on, hitting that deadline, putting the 10 o'clock news on. And we often get very nervous if we start playing with that process because, oh my goodness, what happens if we don't hit that deadline? And so part of the rigidity is the fact that we are operating very quickly to produce this real-time product. And the last one is priorities, because it's what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the activity of the 18 to 37-year-olds or the 53 to 97-year-olds who actually consume much more of our product than the 18 to 37-year-olds do? And so there's a lot of question about priorities. So what they say is, when attempting to change an organization's culture, the starting point is the task that you're trying to do, not the process or the culture. And to me, this is really key. And so how do you figure out the task? So, and then he goes on to say, this is because processes and priorities are a response to recurring tasks. To me, the thing is, always consider the audience first. What's the public we're trying to serve? How are they behaving? How do they consume public media? How can we serve them and achieve our public service mission? And when you think of the audience, we think of the jobs to be done. And we'll talk a bit more about this in the workshop this afternoon. But basically, the jobs to be done for our audience. Let me just give you an example that they use in the report. So the Metro, launched in 1995. Now, as a journalist, I would say, well, the job to be done here is to be informed and to know what's going on. But for a lot of people, the job to be done is, I've got 10 minutes to kill, or I'm on my commute, and I need something to read or something to do. So I'll read Metro. It's free. So they back it up a little bit and say, it's, as a journalist, I think that everyone wants to be informed, and so therefore the job is to be informed, when really the job is, I've got 10 minutes to kill. Well, the thing is, if you've got 10 minutes to kill these days, a lot of times what you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking at something on this, talking to your friends, playing a game. So there's a lot of other ways now to kill those 10 minutes. So how do we get into that process where we're part of that commute or we're part of that 10 minutes? And once you've got the task, then you know how to change the process. As production people, if we say to you, we need this, you're great. You can do it, you can get it done. That's not the problem. But the real issue is changing the task. So I'm just going to end on this. It was the 50th anniversary of public media in the United States. And there's a really good report by the Knight Foundation, Public Media at 50, looking at the future. And I really recommend it. And it's linked to in the presentation so you can read it. And they look back and they look forward. And they even have contrary voices from people who say there shouldn't be any funding for public media. That it should just be, in the US, it should just be supported by people who want to support it. A nice American libertarian view of things. And so there's lots of good things there. But I would say in everything that I have said up to this point, I just want to finish on this. Public media isn't an industry or a service, it's a mission not yet accomplished. So when we think now about the tasks and how we want to serve the public, think of how we accomplish that mission. Thank you, and I'm ready for your questions. Please.